In 1732, a group of soldiers marched through the soaked fields of Serbia, sent to investigate whispers of graves disturbed and villagers dying without fever. Their orders were simple: find the cause and restore calm. But when the coffin split under their hands, they realized the dead did not rest and the night would not end quietly. So before we continue, please make sure to subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. Thanks. Rain dragged across the low hills and turned the road to paste that clung to our boots and the mules' hooves. We left the garrison at Shabbats at first light, with orders to inspect a village 2 days to the south. The report said a grave had been opened. Several people had died without fever, and the living were afraid to sleep. There were 6 of us under Sergeant Marco. Corporal Weiss walked second, back straight, jaw tight. Jovan and Stoyan took the pack mule. Luka, the youngest, kept close to me and watched everything with wide eyes. Father Ilya walked near the mule with a small leather bag of oil and a wooden cross at his collar. Our surgeon Kramer carried his case tied shut with cord. I kept the ledger and the powder. Rain soaked the felt of our hats and ran into our collars. No one spoke unless the road forced a choice of path. The air smelled of wet straw and wood smoke that drifted from farms we passed without stopping. We reached the village near dusk on the second day. Low houses sat close to the earth with sod and thatch. Smoke lay flat over the roofs. No dogs called. Doors were shut. A small church of rough stones stood at the edge near a ring of poplars. The headman met us at the lane. He said his name was Rajko. His eyes were red at the edges and his voice rasped from little sleep. He led us into his house and gave us bread, boiled barley, and a place at the fire. Father Ilya thanked him. The room smelled of damp wool and smoke. An old woman lay on a bench in the shadow with a wet cloth on her head. She coughed once and did not move again. Rajko told us the tale in short sentences. 3 children had died in 9 nights. An old woman followed on the 10th. None had burned with fever or cried out. They weakened near dawn and did not wake. 2 cows had been found with their throats open in the morning, bodies still warm. No prints that matched a boot or a paw. A young mother woke each night, gasping with a heavy pressure across her chest. Blood ran from her nose without cause. Men lit straw at the corners of their yards and set small branches of hawthorn above their doors. Someone had found a grave by the church wall sunk lower than the others. A small cross planted there had snapped in the middle. No one wanted to stand in the churchyard after sunset. He spoke without color in his voice, as if a long day had scraped it clean. Weiss asked about strangers on the road, deserters or river traders. Rajko shook his head. He said a farmhand named Vukashin had fallen from a hay cart a month ago and died before morning. The sunken grave was his. No one had touched the earth there. Father Ilya listened and kept his hand on the cross at his collar. He had buried the last of the dead with the usual prayers. He had not returned to the churchyard that day. Kramer asked about swellings, rashes, or stomach pain. Rajko had seen none. Marco told me to write every name and date. The pen felt cold in my fingers, but the page filled. We took quarters in the sacristy. The room smelled of wet stone, wax, and old smoke. We stacked the muskets by the door and hung our cloaks along the pews. Stoyan checked flints. Jovan set a bundle of garlic, iron nails, and a mallet on the table. Weiss told him to put them away and keep to orders. Jovan left them where they were and said nothing. No one pressed the point. I rolled powder into paper and tied cartridges until my fingers stiffened. Luka warmed his socks at the coals and avoided looking at the table. Outside, the rain thinned to a drift. At last light, we walked to the churchyard with Rajko and the priest. Old stones leaned in crooked rows. 6 new mounds rose near the wall, still raw and dark. One had sunk more than the others. Rainwater had not gathered there. The cross that should have stood at its head lay broken in the grass. Marco pressed his heel into the soil and drew it back wet and soft. Weiss said clay often gave under long rain, but his voice lacked strength. Father Ilya looked at the broken cross and then at the wall. Our orders named the signs that allowed us to open a grave. I read them aloud in the mist. We took consent from Rajko and from the priest. He gave it with a flat face. We fetched spades. I dug with Marco and Jovan while Luka held the lantern. The earth stuck to the blades and to our boots. We worked without talk. When Jovan's spade struck wood, Luka started and made the light jump. We cleared the lid, lifted the nails one by one and pulled the swollen board free. The corpse lay in a coarse shroud. The cloth at the chest was damp from within. The face had not collapsed the way I had seen in other graves opened after a month. The lips were full. A dark smear marked the corner of the mouth and still shone. Red stained the nails. The beard looked longer than at burial. A sharp metal scent rose from the box, not sweet rot. Kramer pressed 2 fingers to the cloth above the chest and felt a soft give under the ribs. He withdrew his hand and wiped it on his coat. No one spoke for a while. Father Ilya looked at the mouth, then at the hands. Raiko kept his distance and watched with his jaw moving, teeth on teeth. Weiss told us to seal the coffin, pack the earth, and hold watch through the night. He said we would take further steps at dawn if needed. Marco agreed. We replaced the lid, hammered the nails down, and filled the grave. Marco set the broken cross across the mound until a new one could be cut. The light had gone fully by the time we finished. We posted watches. Marco put me and Luca by the sunken grave. Weiss stood at the church door. Jovan and Stoyan took the wool. Marco walked a slow line between us. The rain stopped and the air cooled. A narrow moon climbed over the poplars. No doors opened in the village. No dog sounded. I heard a stream somewhere beyond the fields and cattle shifting in their shed. I sat with the musket across my knees and tried to measure the night by breaths. Luca rubbed his palms along the stock of his gun to keep the feeling in his fingers. I told him to save the lantern oil. He nodded and set it down. Near midnight, a smell drifted along the lane beyond the wall. It matched the sharp scent from the coffin. I signaled to Luca. He stayed still and reached for the lantern but did not light it. A thin sound followed the smell. It was not a step or a breath. It was a slow pull, then a swallow. Careful and small, my teeth met hard. I lifted the musket and moved to a gap in the stones. Wet leaves lay along the lane. The path led toward the cattle shed and the well. I waved Marco over. He came at once with Weiss close behind. We climbed the wall and dropped into the lane. Father Ilya raised a lantern inside the yard, and its light spilled through the gap. The thin sound stopped. Marco went toward the shed. I took the wood pile. Weiss went to the well. A hen lay on its side beside the split logs. Its neck was open. The dirt beneath it showed only a small dark patch. Feathers were neat and close. No drag marks, no scatter. Weiss hauled the bucket up from the well. The rope dripped. Streaks ran down the wood of the bucket and shone in the lantern light. He tipped it, and thin red lines fell to the stones. He did not speak. Marco returned from the shed. The cattle stood calm, heads down. We found prints in the lane that fit neither boot nor paw. They were long and narrow. The toes had sunk deeper than the heels. The step was short and even. The prints ended at the edge of the stony field and did not continue beyond. We turned back. Rachko stood at the church gate with a woodcutter's axe across his hands. I had not seen it before. He asked if we had found a man. Marco told him what we had seen. Rachko set the axe head on the ground and held the handle with both palms. He said his sister-in-law lay in his house and could not sleep. He said he would not leave the churchyard. Father Ilya told him to stand under the porch. He obeyed. We took our posts again. Oil ran low and we let the lantern die. The moon gave enough light to mark the wall and the dark humps of the graves. Luca asked in a low voice whether the dead could call the living by name. I told him people could frighten themselves and then hear what they feared. He went quiet. I felt the weight of the musket grow heavy in my arms, and I shifted it to keep the blood moving in my hands. The last hour before dawn, a whisper rose behind the church door. It was thin, steady, and pressed close to the wood. There were no words I could make out. Weiss reached the door in 3 steps and set his back against it. Marco raised his musket. I brought mine to my shoulder. The whisper stopped. A hard pressure touched the door from the other side. Many small points dug into the wood at once in a tight cluster. The wood creaked. We held our breath. The pressure eased and returned, then eased again, then left. No latch moved. No foot crossed a threshold. Birds shifted in the hedges when the first pale color showed behind the poplars. The sharp smell thinned and then was gone. Rajko lowered the axe and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. Luca leaned his head against the wall and closed his eyes for a heartbeat. I did not feel relief, only a clear sense that the day ahead would not return the village to what it had been. Marco told us to hold our places until full light and then gather in the sacristy to decide the next steps. I checked the flint with my thumb, felt the rough edge and waited for the sun to clear the trees. We assembled in the sacristy when the sun cleared the trees. The room held the damp of the night. Marco had us sit and report in turn. I told what I had seen at the woodpile. Weiss spoke of the bucket. Jovan mentioned the prints that ended in the stones. Stoyan had nothing more to add from the wall. Father Ilia described the pressure against the door. Kramer noted the condition of the corpse we had uncovered. Marco said the signs were enough to act. He told me to copy the order that allowed us to disturb a burial and to record who witnessed it. I wrote the words and named each man present. Rajko signed with a mark. We went to the churchyard at once. The ground held water but no standing puddles. The cross we had laid across the mound lay shifted by a hand's width. Marco told us to work in a clean way. Jovan and I cut the soil. Weiss lifted the nails with a pry bar. Kramer kept the lantern open to the light to air it. When the lid came free, the smell rose at once, sharp and iron. The cloth over the chest showed a dark area that had spread. The mouth was no longer closed. The teeth had broken the shroud at the lips from the inside. The beard hair looked damp at the tips. The fingers had drawn inward and held the cloth as if seized by a cramp. The skin showed color that should not have remained. Kramer held a small mirror to the nostrils. No fog formed. He pressed at the lower stomach and said something had collected there. Father Ilia crossed himself and then set his hand down. Marco asked the priest to state the rites required by local custom when such a case arose. The priest said the steps known to the elders were clear. Open the body, remove the head, place it between the legs, and fill the mouth with earth from the grave. Rajko said the same had been told to him as a child, though no one in his time had done it. Weiss said we should carry the coffin to the open yard and work where all could see. Marco agreed. We lifted it with care. We laid the coffin on the grass. Kramer opened his case. He chose a saw and a long knife. He worked without comment. When he cut, a rush of dark fluid spilled and ran into the earth. It did not carry the smell of decay. The muscles twitched once when he cut the neck. He set the head down. The eyes held a wet shine for a few breaths and then dulled. He packed the mouth with soil. We placed the head between the knees. Father Ilia read a short prayer. Marco told me to note every action and the time. We closed the coffin and put the earth back. Rajko stood with the axe lowered and watched the whole time. He asked nothing. When the mound was level, he said his sister-in-law had worsened with the dawn. He begged us to come. Marco sent me, Luca, and Kramer with him. Weiss stayed to speak with the men who had gathered near the lane. The house was low and dark. A young woman lay on a mat with her hands on her chest. Her lips were pale at the edges. Kramer checked her pulse and eyelids. He opened his case and mixed water with a measure from a bottle. He told her to drink. She obeyed with effort. Two small children watched from the corner. A man stood near the door with his face turned away. The woman spoke in a tired voice. She said a weight pressed her each night and held her still. She said she could not cry out. She felt breath at her neck but could not lift a hand. With first light, the weight left. No one in the house had seen anything. Kramer marked small holes on the side of her throat, not deep, already closed. He cleaned them and set a clean cloth over the skin. He told her to rest through the day and to sleep with others in the same room that night. He told the man to hang branches of hawthorn over the window and to keep a candle burning until dawn. The man nodded at once. We checked the cattle shed. The floor showed a dry sweep as if something had passed low. A patch of hair clung to a post, fine and pale. Not wool, not cow. I wrapped the hairs in paper and slid them into the ledger. The well rope had been cut and tied back together near the bucket. The knots were tight and showed no loose ends. I recorded that also. We took note of 3 houses where the people said they could not rest. In each, the same marks appeared at the throat or chest of one sleeper. No blood had stained the bedclothes. No animal had been hurt. All pointed to the church when we asked for a place of fear. By midday, the sky cleared and a weak sun warmed the yard. Weiss sent the men to cut fresh stakes of ash and hawthorn. Stoyan split them with a measured rhythm. Jovan hammered iron nails through the tops and left the points sticking out. Marco sent Luca with me to collect straw and a barrel lid. He said we would make torches for the night. Kramer boiled water with juniper and rosemary and told the women to wash the rooms where the sick lay. Father Ilya spoke with the elders about sins or quarrels that might have caused misfortune. They gave him nothing more than daily hardship and the grief of the recent burials. In the afternoon, we examined the other graves. The new ones showed no change. At one old stone, the earth felt hollow under the spade in a narrow run toward the wall. We followed the soft pocket with care and found a rat hole that had widened. The bone pile inside was clean and small. Jovan cursed and marked the hole with lime. He said rats stirred fear where they ran under the earth. Weiss said it did not explain the other signs. Marco said both could be true and moved us on. When the sun began to fall, we fixed our plan. Weiss and Stoyan would guard the church door again. Marco and I would keep the churchyard at the graves. Jovan and Luca would sit in the lane between the well and the shed. Father Ilya and Kramer would visit the sick and stay at the house of the young woman. Rajko and 3 men would keep watch near the poplars with torches and axes, not to roam, only to raise an alarm if they saw a shape cross the path. We agreed on 3 horn blasts for danger and 1 for a call to gather. I tested the horn and checked the cord. Before we separated, we ate bread, cheese, and boiled roots. The food sat heavy, but it steadied our hands. Marco spoke to each of us in turn. He told me to wait for signs and not to fire at shadows. He told Luca to keep his head and to speak if he felt weakness. Luca nodded with his jaw set. Weiss cleaned his lock and kept his powder dry. Jovan tucked a small cross under his coat and said nothing. Stoyan checked the torches. Kramer refilled his case. The priest took holy oil and a small spade. The first hour of darkness passed with only village sounds. A door creaked and shut. Cows shifted. A woman sang to a child in a low voice and stopped. The air cooled and then held steady. The sharp scent did not come at once as it had the night before. I walked my line along the graves with the musket ready and the stake tied at my side with a cord. Marco kept to the wall and looked toward the lane now and then. A movement showed near the edge of the yard. Not a man and not a dog. It kept low to the ground. More a change in the shape of the dark than a body crossing the open. I lifted the horn but held back to be sure. I felt my breath shorten and counted to steady it. The shape stopped and flattened against a stone. It looked as if the shadow thickened, then thinned, then thickened again. I signaled to Marco. He came without sound and stood at my shoulder. The shape slid toward the grave we had opened and then closed. It stopped at the head of the mound. It drew back and then pressed down on the earth above the sealed coffin. The soil dented a little as if a palm had leaned on it. I raised the horn and blew 3 blasts. The sound cracked the stillness and rolled across the houses. Weiss answered with 1 blast from the door to say he had heard. Jovan's torch flared beyond the wall. Raiko's men shouted at the poplars. The shape turned its head toward the sound. I saw a long bare scalp in the weak light, stretched thin over bone with fine hair at the back. The face kept low and did not show itself. Marco moved forward with the bayonet fixed. I stepped with him. The shape slid back along the grass with a smooth motion that showed no effort. It passed the old stones and reached the wall. It did not climb. It went through the gap like smoke would pass a crack, yet there was stillness in the air. My skin lifted in a way I cannot explain by wind or chill. I followed to the gap, but it had gone from sight. Weiss joined us at the wall. He said the door had held and nothing pressed this time. Jovan and Luca arrived with torches. Luca breathed fast and gripped his musket too high on the stock. Marco told him to lower his hands and slow his breathing. Rajko's men held back at the gate as ordered. We stood and listened. A child cried once and fell silent. Then came a cry that belonged to a man. It came from the lane near the well. We ran. The torch smoke trailed along the stones. At the well, a farmer lay on his back with his throat torn open. The cut was clean and deep. Blood soaked his shirt, but had not spread far on the ground. His eyes moved but did not focus. Kramer reached us at a run with his case. He pressed cloth to the wound and told the man to hold it. The man's hands did not obey. He died between one breath and the next. We searched around the well with torches low to the ground. The stones showed a wet line leading toward the road and then vanishing at a hard patch. No prints, no drag. The rope at the bucket was cut again, but the bucket hung in place. The water in it looked darker than it should. Weiss lowered it and lifted it back. Thin red threads ran down the side. He lowered it again and left it there. We carried the dead man into the church. The people who had gathered at the gate began to murmur. Marco told them to go indoors and bolt their doors. He told them to sleep in groups. He told them to keep a light burning. He said we would watch the rest of the night. The murmuring turned to low prayers and then faded as doors shut. Only the priest, Rajko, and the elders stayed with us. Kramer washed his hands at the font and dried them on his sleeve. He said the cut was made by a narrow mouth, with teeth at the front sharper than at the sides. He said he had not seen a wolf or a dog leave a wound like that. He did not try to explain it further. We took our posts again. The night held its shape without wind. No more cries came. Once a hen flapped in a shed and then settled. The moon moved behind a cloud and did not appear again. I stood with my musket and felt a tiredness that did not open a path to sleep. I kept my mind on the plan and on the next steps. When dawn came, we would need to decide whether to set a trap at the grave or at the houses. We could not do both with our number. I thought of the woman who could not breathe at night and of the dead man by the well. I had no doubt the thing would return. I checked the priming once more and waited for the first change in the sky. The first color in the east showed pale and slow. The torches had burned low and only smoke rose from them. Marco called us together. His face looked worn, his eyes dark at the edges. He said we had stopped nothing. The grave was not enough. The thing had left the churchyard and taken a man alive. We needed to force it out before more fell. He told Weiss and me to walk the village and ask if anyone had worsened in the night. Jovan and Luca were to dig at the grave again and watch for movement beneath. Stoyan would carve more stakes. Kramer would stay with the sick. The priest would bless every room. Raiko and his men would guard the edge of the fields. Weiss and I went door to door. At one house we found a girl pale and weak with blood at the corner of her mouth. Her mother said she had cried once in her sleep, and then lay still. Kramer came with us and examined her. He said her pulse ran too fast and her breath too shallow. He washed the marks at her neck with wine and pressed cloths to stop the bleeding. He gave her herbs to drink, but shook his head when he thought she could not see. At two other houses, the people said they had heard scratching on the shutters, though no one was outside when they opened the door. At a barn, a calf lay dead with its belly torn. The wound was at the chest, not the throat. The calf's eyes looked wide and flat, its tongue blackened. I wrote each detail in the ledger. The pages grew heavier with the words. When we returned to the churchyard, Luca and Jovan had opened the grave again. They stood pale and silent. The coffin lay split. The head we had placed between the knees was gone. The shroud had shifted as if dragged. The mouth was empty of soil. The lid had not been forced from above. The nails bent outward from inside. Luca crossed himself again and again. Jovan spat and said the work had failed. Marco told him to keep his tongue. We lowered the lid again and sealed it with new nails, though none of us believed it would hold. By noon the sky was white and hot. The village looked smaller under it, as if the roofs pressed lower. No one stayed outside. We saw curtains shift. Doors stayed bolted. The air held still. Marco said we would not wait for the thing to strike again at night. He said we would set a trap in daylight when it might be weaker. Weiss asked how we could bait what had no shape. The priest said the graves were its anchor. If it returned to its resting place, we could force it with fire and prayer. Rako said he would stand with us. Marco ordered straw, oil, and more wood to be brought. We stacked them near the grave. The people helped with their heads down and their mouths shut. The afternoon passed without sound, but for the chopping of stakes and the ring of nails. Kramer stayed with the girl and the young mother. He came once to tell us both had slipped further. Their faces turned grey and their lips trembled with each breath. He said if the thing was not stopped, no bed would stay safe. Marco listened and gave no answer. He sharpened his bayonet on the stone and watched the grave. Towards sunset, Jovan saw movement near the poplars. A man stood at the edge of the field. He looked thin with shoulders sharp through his coat. His face was hidden by the low light. He raised one arm as if in greeting, but did not move closer. Rajko shouted a name, Vukashin. The man had been dead a month. The figure turned and the back showed a torn shirt and pale skin at the back of the neck. Then it dropped low and crossed into the field with a stride that covered ground too fast for a walk. By the time we reached the hedge, it was gone. The crops lay unbent, the soil unmarked. We stood with muskets lifted, but no shape returned. We returned to the churchyard with our decision fixed. We would fire the grave that night and hold the ground until nothing stirred. The priest said prayers as we laid the straw in layers, soaked it with oil and set wood in a ring. We placed torches close by but did not light them yet. Marco ordered us to keep our posts as before. When full dark came, we would strike the fire and not let it be put out. He told us not to turn from the grave whatever we saw. The sky deepened. A wind rose for the first time in days, low and steady as if drawn from the earth itself. Doors shut harder. Dogs barked once, then fell silent. Our torches shook in the breeze. The scent returned, iron and raw. Luca clenched the horn in his fist. Jovan gripped the stake. I steadied my musket and felt sweat on my neck despite the cold. The soil at the mound shifted. At first it was no more than a ripple, then a clear bulge as if something pressed upward from below. The earth cracked. A pale hand broke through, nails long and dark with soil. The priest shouted for us to hold and to keep our ground. Marco gave the order. We set the torches to the straw. Flame took fast and climbed around the coffin. The hand withdrew, then struck again. The mound split wider. A head rose, grey and smeared with soil, eyes bright with a wet gleam. The mouth opened and the teeth shone red in the firelight. Weiss fired at once. The shot struck the temple, but the figure did not fall. It pushed higher, shoulders and chest forcing through the soil. The beard was matted with dark fluid, the lips torn back. It turned its eyes on us, not clouded like a corpse, but sharp, focused. Jovan thrust with his stake, but the thing caught it and bent the wood. Marco lunged with his bayonet. The steel pierced the shoulder, and the thing hissed without breath. Fire roared higher around the mound, and the smell thickened until my throat burned. I lifted my musket and fired into the chest. The body staggered but did not fall. Luca blew the horn, the blast sharp and frantic. The villagers cried out from their houses. The thing struck at Marco, tearing cloth and skin from his arm. Weiss jammed his stake into its side and drove it down into the soil. The priest shouted prayers louder. Flames took the shroud and spread along the hair. The eyes rolled white, then black. The body twisted with strength that shook the ground. Stoyan struck at the neck with an axe again and again, until the head tore loose and rolled into the fire. The limbs thrashed once, then went still. The air shook with a sound like a low groan that came from the ground itself. Then it ended. Only the fire crackled. The people began to gather at the gate. No more cries came from the houses. No weight pressed the doors. The smell thinned. Marco stood bleeding, his sleeve torn. Kramer bound his arm with cloth. Luca sat with his musket across his knees, staring at the fire. Weiss looked at the blackened head in the flames until the skin burst and fell away. Jovan leaned on his stake, shoulders shaking with breath. The priest said the last prayer and marked the air with a cross. When the fire burned down, we buried the ashes deep with lime and sealed the grave with stone. The villagers helped in silence. At dawn, the girl and the young mother woke with color in their cheeks. No mark showed fresh on their skin. The cattle sounded as before. The air held no sharp scent. Rajko thanked us and laid the axe at the church wall. We left with the sun at our backs, boots heavy with earth and ash. Marco's arm was bound, but he walked steady. No one spoke for a long time. I wrote the final account in the ledger that night. The words did not ease my mind, but they set the shape of what had happened. We had faced what the village feared, and it had shown itself true. We had met it, burned it, and put it down,